started, again, I want to extend a big thank you to the entire Beacon project team for organizing this call for proposals, for providing such good feedback early on, thorough reviews, and just keeping us all on track. And of course to Templeton for continuing to build dialogue and intellectual camaraderie between religion and science. It's very cool. And then finally, I want to acknowledge my student, Christopher Smith, who has been instrumental in helping getting this project off the ground. So as many of you know by now, I work with the Hadza, who are one of the last remaining populations of hunter-gatherers left on the planet. What that means is that about 90% of the calories they consume still come from hunted and foraged foods. And what I want to do today is I want to start by providing a brief ethnographic description of the Hadza, tell you about their social organization, their cultural and economic practices, as well as their religious beliefs. And I think this is important for not only highlighting why the Hadza are an ideal population to study the origins of moral exceptionalism, but I think it will be helpful in making sense of some of the data that I will be sharing with you. And then I will share the findings from three studies I conducted with the Hadza that address three broad questions. So the first asks whether the Hadza have a folk psychology for the existence of moral exemplars and just character in general. This is something that, you know, we in the West tend to believe that some people stand out in terms of their moral character, but is this a universal belief? The second question is, asks, okay, well, regardless of whether we believe in exemplars or not, do moral exemplars actually exist in the Hadza? Are there some individuals that do stand out in terms of their exemplary behavior? And then finally, if there's time, we'll address the final question: what is the function or purpose of moral stories that feature exemplary character? So these are stories that we tell our children, but do we just do it for the entertainment value, or do these stories actually serve a purpose? Is there an adaptive function? Is it to teach or to promote moral character? So I'll be addressing all three of these questions with research in the Hadza. And I know many people have said this at this conference, but I too want to preface this by saying this is still very much a work in progress. I'm going to be showing you the first pass at this data. There's a whole lot more that needs to be done, so feedback and suggestions are absolutely welcome. So the Hadza reside in an approximately 4,000 square kilometer area in northern Tanzania, in this area here. It's estimated that there are about maybe 1,000 or so Hadza that still identify as Hadza, but only 300 or so are still subsisting primarily by means of hunting and gathering, and this is the group that I work with. Most Hadza know Swahili. This is generally how I communicate with them, but they do speak their own language called Hadzani. It's a click language unlike any other language on the planet. It's what linguistics call an isolate. Most Hadza are illiterate and also innumerate. This is going to be important later on. So in Hadzani, for instance, there are no numbers that go past 4. The Hadza live in small groups, so I call these groups camps, so I'll be using this terminology a lot. They number about 30 individuals. Camps generally consist of 2 or 3 extended families, but they can and they do fluctuate in size, generally in response to the availability of resources in the area. And the camps also move every 6 to 8 weeks at a time as they use up the resources in an area, so they're nomadic. Camp residence is flexible, and individuals frequently move between camps as well. So if I sample them from year to year, individuals are living with only on average about 25% of their prior campmates. What this means is that you never really encounter the same camp twice. So it's always in different locations and different people in the camps. Food acquisition is characterized by a sexual division of labor where men target animal-based resources, small things, birds, rats, up to really big things, antelope, giraffe, and so forth. They also collect honey. Women target plant-based foods. They'll gather berries, they'll dig for tubers. A couple of things to keep in mind that I think are important to note about the Hadza. They are remarkably egalitarian. Acquired foods are brought back to camp. Any of them that come back to camp, they're shared fairly evenly with all camp members. So there's, I don't know, I would say pretty much like 100% taxation and redistribution in the Hadza, and if packages are sufficiently large, right, they'll even share it with nearby camps as well. The Hadza have also been described as being non-hierarchical. There are no job specializations. Everyone can pretty much do anything. When they make their decisions, they generally make them together as a group. Many anthropologists have described the Hadza as either having no religion or a very minimal form of religion. And there hasn't been that much written on it, perhaps just because there hasn't been that much to write on it, right? But the ethnographic descriptions suggest that they don't have any religious structures, leaders, no religious ceremonies, nor do they have a belief in the afterlife. They do have a cosmology. It consists of the sun, the moon, and the stars, who they say that are their children. Frank Marlowe, who is an anthropologist, my actual academic father, my advisor, when he worked with him, he claimed that some Hadza said they believed in God, Haney, and he said that that was the male form of Ishoko. Never elaborated on this. That's pretty much all that was said on this. So in 2014, I conducted an in-depth study of Hadza religious beliefs because, there hadn't been any systematic study of it, but also because Christian missionaries had become increasingly common. They still are making their way into Hadza land, and this could have affected some of their beliefs. And in fact, that's what I'm finding now. So I interviewed 70 individuals about their religious beliefs, and the majority actually say they believe in God. So 75% of people say, yes, I believe in a God. When you dig deeper and you ask, okay, well, what kind of God is this, right? Is it the God of major religions? Is this a morally inclined, powerful, omniscient being? Well, not really, right? So this is just the individuals who believe here, right? Only about half of those individuals who say they believe in God, of them, most of them say that they do not believe that Haney has, supernatural capabilities, such as the ability to choose what happens to people after they die, reward people who are good, punish people who are bad, and so forth. So compared to many societies, their belief in an omniscient and powerful God who, has these moralizing concerns is quite limited still. It's been said that the Hadza do have a creation story of how they came to be on this earth. These are second-hand ethnographic accounts. They generally involve humans climbing down to earth on a baobab tree or sliding down on the neck of a giraffe. In my own questioning of the Hadza, about half of them claim that they have no idea how the earth started, right? Or how people claim to be. They said, oh, only my ancestors could know such a thing. Someone told me I should ask like the oldest person in the camp. But not a single Hadza evoked the use of giraffes or trees in their creation stories. When I asked the Hadza, well, what happens after you die? The majority of people said they didn't know or did not think that there was an afterlife. And in fact, many of their accounts, when I asked them, evoked earthly sorts of descriptions, right? So what happens to you after you die? And they would say, well, you get buried. And I'd say, well, what happens to you after you die? Then what happens after that? And they'd say, well, people cry. What happens after that? And after I do this, a number of times they would say mwisho, which is the Swahili word for it's the end. But there are people who have begun to adopt Christian beliefs. They discuss the ideas of heaven and hell. They discuss the idea of God creating the earth. Life is not easy for the Hadza. I think this is important to note. Infant mortality is high, and only about 55% of Hadza will survive till the age of 15, so just a little over half. Not surprisingly, life expectancy at birth is only 33 years. The greatest proportion of Hadza death is due to routine infections. Also, injuries are common, generally falls from trees, but there can be injuries from predators as well, snakes, leopards, hyenas, and lions. They live far away from being able to get any medical care, even if they had money to get the medical care. Who's to say that it would even be good? In my own questioning about the Hadza, about 82% say that they worry about there being enough food to feed their families. And then work is just really hard. So for instance, women engage in manual labor for on average about 6.5 hours each day. So life is pretty hard. Why study a population like the Hadza? Well, the discipline of psychology and social sciences, in general, has been criticized for its over-reliance on weird populations. By weird, I mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic society. So these are undergrads, right? And this criticism, I think, applies with more force to some claims in psychology, namely those that evoke universal or evolutionary explanations to explain the nature of our species' psychology. So cross-cultural work, it's important because it not only helps us to recognize and appreciate that diversity that's out there, but it also helps us to uncover those behaviors and those traits that really do unite us as a species, right? And then also the Hadza are evolutionarily relevant, which is important for origins explanations, right? So for the vast majority of our time on the planet, we've lived as hunter-gatherers. About 50,000 generations of differential survival and reproduction took place in a hunter-gatherer way of life. So these societies more closely, I'm going to say more closely, approximate the societies that our ancestors lived in compared to societies that we typically do our research in. So they don't swipe right on Tinder when selecting mates. They don't go and get their groceries from ShopRite or whatever the supermarket is here, I'm not sure. Okay, so why study morality in the Hadza? Well, I want to argue that the empirical setting is ideal for studying moral behavior. So again, the Hadza provide a strong test of universality for the concept that morally exceptional people as a distinct category, this exists. And this again is because of their relative high degree of physical as well as linguistic isolation. And this makes transmitting moral norms, doctrines, stories of heroism, and so on more difficult. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it does make it more difficult. Second, because the Hadza live in an environment where day-to-day survival necessitates high levels of cooperation in terms of food sharing, childcare, helping the sick and elderly, and because they just spend many hours of their day in close proximity to one another, there are many opportunities to both display as well as observe moral behavior. And then finally, because they operate in a world largely devoid of powerful gods with moralizing concerns, centralized, governmental and authoritative institutions, so there are no courts, there are no police that intervene in Hadza affairs, they provide, this rare opportunity to study moral character in the absence of these external monitoring and regulatory structures that we have in more complex societies. And so, for instance, there's research that suggests that both within and across societies, if you have a belief in a morally inclined, powerful, omniscient God, right, who will punish you if you're bad and reward you if you're good, that's going to affect how cooperative you are. Okay, so what do Hadza morals look like? Well, I assessed this first by just using a free response data to the simple question, well, what makes a person good? And I allowed the Hadza to list up to 5 items, and here I just include the 4 items that most people named, and nothing on this list should be that shocking. You might imagine people here naming the same thing, so somebody who is loving, someone who's generous and shares with other people, someone who's peaceful, and so forth. But what I think is most interesting about this list is the most common thing that people said, right? They said that somebody is good if they have a good heart, right? And to me, this sounds a lot like character, right? Someone who encompasses a suite of good traits, right? Just traits that are unchanging and so forth. So going into this project, I did think that the idea of moral character was something that the Hadza did share with us. But then I got some other data that made me question this. So this is some other data of mine that suggests that at least some behavior in the Hadza, behavior that the Hadza consider moral, so generosity, does not appear to be a dispositional stable trait. So this is just one example that I'm going to share with you. Over a 6-year period, what I did is I tracked both migration patterns in the Hadza as well as levels of generosity. So this is a map of Hadza land showing all the different camps that I visited. I have visited 56 different camps. I measured generosity in 400 unique individuals, and crucially, this is the crucial thing, for many of those individuals, I had overlapping data year after year. And so all the circles here represent, again, the camps that I visited. They're color-coded by the year that I visited them, and the size of the circle is proportional to their mean level of generosity that year. And I used a public goods game to elicit cooperation or generosity, and this is a game I think that maps onto their life pretty well, given their high levels of food sharing. And the games were played using sticks of honey. So honey is a favorite food of the Hadza, so I would endow them with 4 sticks of honey, and I told them that they could contribute any amount between 0 to 4 to the public good, and for each stick that they would contribute, I would add 3 additional sticks, or they can keep any amount for themselves. And then the public good was divided between all players in the game. And so they were playing with their campmates, right? So they're playing with all adults in their camp. And for this particular measure, we found evidence for social over dispositional influences on levels of generosity. So we find that the best predictor of an individual's level of cooperation or generosity in every single year was the average level of cooperation of their campmates in that year. And this result survives all sorts of robustness checks controlling for things like sex and age, number of children, geographic location, whether they ever played the game before, camp size, and so on. So what this means is basically we're finding that generous people live together, and this is true year after year. So this graph, all this does is it compares the observed variance in contributions to the variance that's obtained through 1,000 simulations, and we do this every single year. And we keep the population structure fixed, same number of camps, same number of individuals in each camp. And what you find is that compared to chance outcomes, there's significantly less variance within camps and significantly more variance between camps. Again, this is just a fancy way to show that generous people are living together and less generous people are living together. And this is another way to just show it, show the data. So here what we have is each of these individual points represent individuals, and they're just clustered together by their residence, right, by their camp. So these were all individuals who lived together in 2010. These were all individuals who lived together in 2010, and so forth. And then the triangles represent high cooperators, individuals who gave 2 or more honey sticks, and the circles are low cooperators, and the circles represent the high cooperators, the people who gave 2 or more honey sticks. And what you can see is that there's clustering, right? So you can see a lot of cooperators living together here, here, and then there's camps that you can see that have a lot of triangles in them, right? And you see this year after year. Now here's the really interesting thing about this is, remember I told you that Hadza residence is really flexible. So here what we did is we color-coded their residence by we color-coded them by their residence here in 2010, right? And in each subsequent year, we color-coded them by their residence in the prior year. So what you can see is that people are living with new individuals year after year, right? Like about 20%, 20 to 30% on average. And yet we're still finding this clustering of cooperators in social space year after year. And what this set of findings suggests is, you know, one, people are doing what their group does. But what this rules out is this idea of homophily, at least for this one measure, that there are types of individuals and then they're moving to live together to one another. And instead, it supports this idea of social influence. So if you just look at those data for those individuals who we have data for subsequent years, right, there doesn't seem to be any stability in their cooperative behavior over time. So how they play in one year does not predict how they play in another year. So this figure plots current yearly contributions by contributions made in the next subsequent year, right? And the unit of analysis here is the participant year. So the gray circles are just proportional to the number of individuals, the count of individuals in that year. And the blue circles just represent the average of the contribution in the following year as a function of the contribution in the current year, right? So if we thought that people had types, what we should have is this, you know, individuals represented on this 45-degree line. So if you donated 0 in the first year, you should also donate 0 here in this year, and you'd see a lot of people there, and we're not getting that. So this is just like, imagine I just threw up a bunch of scatter plots of, you know, 2010 by 2013, 2013 by 2014, every pre and prior, or pre and post yearly contributions, you would just see flat lines there. But we can still ask, well, maybe that's what moral exceptionalism is, right? It's rising above these situational influences. And what we have here is 3 individuals who gave the maximum amount in multiple years. And perhaps these are the people that we should be looking at. Perhaps these are moral exemplars. So that's really the backdrop on which I want to present some of my current results. So the first question asks whether the Hadza have a folk psychology for the existence of moral exemplars. We know, tales of heroism, virtuousness, and self-sacrifice feature prominently in the world's religions. They dominate our television screens, the pages in our books. They're part of our national identities, cultural identities, and so forth. But it's currently unknown whether they're grounded in truths about a universal human nature or whether they are instead inventions designed to foster good behavior. So for instance, it's been suggested that various cultural beliefs, right, that promote good behavior, they can evolve, right? And this might be one example of them. So to address this, I relied on two methods. One, a content analysis of existing Hadza folk tales, and then I also used interviews using hypothetical moral scenarios where I asked the Hadza how many individuals out of a given subset would do the maximally virtuous thing in that situation. So in the 1930s, the German explorer Ludwig Cole Larsen, he published a book on Hadza folklore. He called it The Elephant Game, and this book contains 50 folk stories from the Hadza. And we had these stories translated for the very first time into English by a professional translator and Esperantist. And then we had these stories rated for their moral content by nearly 2,500 participants in an online marketplace. So each individual was randomly assigned to read one of the stories, and there were about 50 readers per stories. We had comprehension checks just to make sure they understood the stories. And participants knew exactly what the study was about. There was no deception. We told them, like, look, we have, these stories from this hunter-gatherer population. They've never been translated into English. People have never studied the moral content. We're just interested in what these stories are about. There are no right or wrong answers. So after participants read the story, we first asked them about the presence of a moral exemplar in the story. Is there a character in the story that exemplifies a virtue? And then we asked them, does this story contain a moral message? And we get about 70 and 60% of individuals answering in the affirmative to these questions respectively. And we also followed up with individuals with open-ended questions. Okay, well, who is the character and what virtue are they displaying, and what is the moral message? And this is something that we would like to, we are now in the process of coding, and we're going to be looking at those responses. But this preliminary data suggests that yes, a majority of Hadza folk stories contain characters who display exemplary virtuous behavior. Participants then rated the extent to which they agreed with statements pertaining to whether the story's character exhibited various virtues and vices. So these are the virtues up here that we put. So each point actually represents a story, and so it's the average ratings of those participants that read the story. And what you can see, again here, really interesting, generosity is pretty low here, but you actually find that the stories feature a lot of hard work and courage as the high virtues, right? And then here are the vices, and you can see that, the opposite of hard work is featured a lot in the stories, laziness as well here. And one thing that we're actually looking at is the role of reward and punishment in the story. So there was a lot of both, and we're coding those now to see how this might be a means by which one would teach virtues to individuals. In the second study, we used storyboards to elicit beliefs about how many individuals out of a given subset, so in this case 14 individuals, would respond morally in situations where one could demonstrate bravery, hard work, or generosity. And for each story, there were 3 levels of virtuous action that the individual could perform, where one act is deemed as maximally virtuous or the most sacrificial. And then we gave participants 14 playing cards with picture drawings on them that represent Hadza individuals, and we just had them sort them into these 3 categories. How many Hadza would do X out of this group? And again, we had to do it this way because the Hadza are enumerate, and I couldn't just say what proportion of Hadza would do this. So this gives you an example of one of them. So I won't have time to share all of them with you, but here's the one involving bravery. A little boy is playing by himself away from camp when he is cornered by a hungry lion. A nearby Hadza man notices the boy is in danger. He has no bow on him, and he knows that no one else is around to help. He can do one of 3 things. And we had storyboards to help with the translations as well, he can run away from the lion. He can throw rocks at the lion, but from far away to distract it, or he can just, fight the lion with a knife and save the boy. And again, we had stories involving hard work as well as generosity as well. In every scenario, so here's the data, the Hadza claim that there are other Hadza who would do the maximally virtuous thing. The situation, again, hard work is really interesting. The situation involving hard work was the highest. I think in some ways, the bravery example constitutes the most exceptional of behaviors because that's when someone's sacrificing their life potentially to help another person. And here about, the Hadza said about 30% of individuals would intervene and do something like that, right? Which I think is pretty remarkable. Finally, what I think is the most interesting here is the direction, or these, we get the same pattern for generosity and hard work, but in opposite direction there, right? So they just think that, the other Hadza would not be generous, right? But they think a lot of Hadza would be hardworking. So you see the same pattern, but again, the opposite direction, which is, I think, really interesting. Question 2 asks whether moral exemplars exist in Hadza society, and to answer this, what we did is we relied on agreement and peer character evaluations of various virtues. So an overall character measurement, good heart, then as well as generosity, honesty, and then hard work, right? And so we had all individuals within each camp rank all other adults in the camps on each of these traits. We took Polaroid pictures of all of the adults in the camps, and then we just lined up the individuals on the ground, and we said, okay, who is the most generous? And then they would point to someone, we would remove that individual, we'd shuffle them up again, and then we'd say, okay, now select, and we would continue this until all individuals were ranked. And then we also wanted to see whether any of these traits predicted how they played in the public goods game, which I shared with you earlier. So this plot here just shows the average agreement across the camps, right, for the various traits. So Kendall's W is just a measure of agreement that ranges from 0 to 1. So each of these dots for each of these traits just represent the camps. So one thing you're going to notice is that there's just a lot of variation both across the traits, right, in agreement, but also within camps as well. So there are some camps that just seem to really all agree, and there are some camps that don't. Again, what I want to draw, and then you can see that there's some evidence that there is agreement for each of these traits as well. And again, what I want to draw your attention to is this distinction between generosity and effort. There's very little agreement here for generosity. In some camps, it's like pretty close to 0. It's not like right on 0, right? No agreement whatsoever, which corroborates some of the findings which I shared with you with the public goods game. But for hard work, you see that it's actually much higher. And I will just quickly say that hard work and foraging ability are very important traits to the Hadza. We saw it in their folk stories, right? In the hypothetical scenarios, they were pretty optimistic that, other Hadza would engage and do the, work really hard. Frank Marlowe, again, my advisor, who worked with the Hadza some years back, he found that foraging ability was actually, and hard work were ranked highly by both men and women as traits that they look for in prospective mates, right? And ranked higher than things like fidelity, fertility, intelligence, and youth. So it's very important in the Hadza. Some things that I would like to do is try to understand some of the variation between camps in levels of agreement. So how long has the camp been together? Look at geographic effects, which may be important, whether they're residing close to towns and markets. Tourism, alcohol has been a problem in recent years, and that could be, generating some noise here. I didn't partial out self-rankings yet, so individuals included themselves in these rankings, which I think is just going to be really interesting to look at, how they correlate with other rankings. But to the extent that individuals are biased, right, to some extent up or down towards themselves, that could be decreasing some of the agreement. So that's something that I need to look at. Is there agreement in rankings of the top individual in each camp, right? So maybe there are these exemplars out there, right? And people agree on who those are, and they really agree on who those are, but everyone else is just kind of average, so there's less agreement there. So that's something I really want to look at. And then finally, what we did is we also collected cross-camp rankings. So we had Hadza rank all of other Hadza in the entire Hadza universe, and have them point out potential moral exemplars. And we haven't looked at this data yet. But to the extent that moral exemplars are far and few between, right? We're not going to potentially get that from the within camp rankings, and we need to rely on this. Okay. And also not shocking is that none of the rankings that we had predicted public good games contributions, and this is true for whether we controlled for camp fixed effects or not. And again, this shouldn't be too surprising because there is little agreement in who is generous in the camps, and also there's just little variation within camps and levels of generosity because individuals are largely doing what their campmates do. Okay. Do I have time for the final one? It's very short. So the final question concerns the function of moral stories. So the prevailing wisdom is that moral stories promote good character. They inform us about which individuals we should be more like, which traits we should cultivate, and that's exactly what William Bennett, the former secretary, education secretary under Reagan, said. But this was a question that I wanted to explore with the Hadza. So I had 124 Hadza participants. They were told one of 4 stories, fictional stories, about a Hadza man either rescuing a friend or a control version. And half of the stories, the individual, the actor that rescued the person or the control version was rewarded for their good behavior by given a material gift. So again, I had storyboards illustrating this, and then this man's giving his rescuer a knife. So we were just interested in how maybe rewarding the actor might affect future behavior. And then we had individuals play a dictator game. We gave them 7 sticks of basically beef jerky that they could donate to another individual or they could keep for themselves. And then also participants completed a recall task to test their memory of the story. Most individuals recalled, all the questions. There were ceiling effects for the memory task, so they got most of the questions right. So not surprisingly, we find actually no effects of the story on memory. We found that individuals who heard the moral story gave slightly more in the dictator game, but it wasn't significant by any means. And we also didn't find an effect of whether individuals were rewarded or not on levels of generosity. One thing we were curious about is whether believers in an omniscient and moral God act differently to these stories. This is post hoc, but we do find preliminary evidence that non-believers actually give more in the dictator game after hearing the pro-social story, whereas the pro-social story had no effect on believers. It's really hard to know what to make of these results. It's something that we need to replicate, but we cautiously speculate that perhaps pro-social stories can promote generosity in those individuals not already motivated to be generous by another source, like the person upstairs. What we'd like to do now that we have actual Hadza stories is use these stories, right, and go out there and test how these stories might affect behavior, and behavior that seems really important in the Hadza, like hard work, right, and effort. So just my quick summary, do the Hadza have a folk psychology for the existence of moral exemplars? Yes, I think the free list data, the folk stories, as well as the hypothetical scenarios all provide support for this. Again, there seems to be this focus on hard work as a virtue where some individuals stand out. Do moral exemplars actually exist in the Hadza? I think there is some support that there are individual differences in character traits, again, especially for hard work, but we find little evidence for character traits associated with generosity in the Hadza. And then we find weak evidence right now for that these moral stories promote good behavior in the Hadza. So again, my thank yous, which I've already said at the beginning of the talk.
It's interesting that there was so little, well, tons of things that are interesting. Thank you for that. Very full of interesting things. But one particularly interesting thing was the lack of consistency in the behavior, the public goods game, yeah, from year to year. And I noticed one thing you did is you only correlate 1 year at a time to one other year at a time.
No, we concluded that was me aggregating all the results that So I can do that separately, and I find that no effect. But aggregating all the results, still nothing.
So like what if you took like 2010 through 2012, and for each person got their average behavior then, and then 2013 and 2014, each person got their average behavior then, and then correlated those two averages with each other. Did you try that?
I think that's going to diminish my sample quite a bit because I don't have that many. I don't have many people who I have, data for 3 or 4 years. I have a lot of people who I have, data for 2 years, but then it just goes down a little bit.
That if you did, you might get some consistency if you were able to do that. But
Okay, that's interesting. I will try it.
well, it sounds like it might be hard.
But one thing that I also think would be interesting to explore with the Hadza is, what do they make of this public goods game, right? So there's this game that, what's so interesting is that this game, I think, maps onto their life really well with their, high levels of sharing publicly. And then in private, it's like, oh, whoa, they're not sharing at all, right? And it's like, what is going on here? And so just asking them, well, what do you make of somebody who behaves this way in the game? I think is going to be really interesting because it could be that being really generous is actually not viewed as something that's good. It could just be viewed as showing off, for instance, right? And actually the virtuous thing to do is to give as much as everyone else gives. And so that's something that I want to look at too in the future.
Yeah, kind of related to that. I was thinking, like, if everyone is sort of assimilating to the social norms that they find themselves like, involved in at the time, then generosity as how you're, denoting cooperation aside, doesn't that suggest like everyone is a persistent cooperator as far as the social norms go?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Or everyone's affected by the people around them, and everyone is in some ways a conditional cooperator, right? I mean, the data is in line with theories for the evolution of cooperation, theories of reciprocity, as well as social norms theories, cultural evolution, and so forth. Yeah, it's just partner choice models. That's what it rules out largely.
I think I missed that point. The public goods game, was that played publicly or anonymously?
It was confidential.
Okay. So then it's really interesting how they know what others would give in that game.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other interesting, it was all confidential, so they don't know how each other is going to play in the game.
Yeah, but your data is showing that.
Oh, right, that they're still mapping onto what other people do, right, yeah. That's one of the things that I think is remarkable about this, and it's consistent year after year. Yeah. With the dictator game, what I thought was really interesting about the findings in the dictator game that we played, this last one, is actually the number of meat sticks that were given was quite high compared to prior games played with the Hadza. And I'm just thinking that, maybe these stories just in some ways just generated an overall, the control story was kind of a nice story as well. And so I'm wondering if just the stories in general had effect on cooperation, because their levels of the average Hadza and dictator games would used to give like very low offers, at least from when Frank Marlowe played them years ago. And we get we get them giving like about 3-4 sticks or so of meat, which is much higher. So I'm wondering if, maybe the stories, all of the stories just had an effect. Yeah.
Do you think that the fact that their language doesn't use numbers essentially affects how generous they would be in those practices?
I don't think so. We would have to have an explanation for why you still get this finding. They're consistent within their groups, right? And I simulate all of the amounts as well of the honey stick. So I'm like, I go through every iteration. If you put in one, I add this many, and if you put in, and then I show the sticks and so forth. And even in one of the years, I wasn't even out there. I had my Tanzanian research assistant run the study along with a Hadzani speaking RA as well, and no differences there.
So I'm interested in sort of speculative, speculative interpretive results. So, see, your results some of them were kind of mixed.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what it means for the basic questions that the results were mixed. So suppose it was the case that there was no concept of the morally exceptional in the Hadza, but there is in sort of, say, in American culture. What would that say about?
Yeah, so I mapped this out into a 4x4 in case I was asked this question. But so, do moral exemplars exist in Hadza society? Yes. Do the Hadza have a folk psychology for the existence of moral exemplars? This would suggest that, yeah, beliefs regarding moral exemplars are grounded in truth, right? And if we found that, moral exemplars don't exist in the Hadza society, but they do have a folk psychology for it, this suggests that maybe, prototypes for moral exemplars might just be artifacts of, the way we categorize information and so forth in the world. Maybe it helps us make sense of the world and so forth. If the Hadza have a folk psychology for the existence of moral exemplars, but there are no exemplars in Hadza society, this suggests that maybe there's just no benefit to knowing who moral exemplars are, or any benefit to hearing stories about them. And then finally, if you find that no moral exemplars don't exist in Hadza society, but they have a folk psychology just like we do here, it suggests that maybe this is a cultural belief that has been perhaps invented because it promotes, right, generosity and good things, morality and so forth, and that's something that would need to be tested. So,
Yeah, great question.
Thanks. In response to one of the questions, you suggested that maybe extreme generosity just isn't really viewed as a...
potentially, and that's at least what they find for other forager societies, for instance. Yeah.
I was wondering whether you thought that, is there any way of testing what you think it might apply to other virtues? So attacking the knife is going too far, really. It's the standard of this.
I can't imagine that being the case, but I mean, it's possible, right? Hard work, I think, is interesting. I don't think, so one of the things that I have asked the Hadza before when I map social networks of the Hadza is I've asked them, who would you like to live with in a future camp, like as a future campmate, right? Who are the most appealing people? And what I find is that those individuals who are the most cooperative, at least measured by the public goods game, aren't nominated the most, right? But those individuals who have attributes associated with things like that maybe signal the ability to acquire resources, so like upper body strength, muscle mass, they're fatter, they're taller, all of those sorts of things, those individuals are nominated more. So my thinking is that there exists that, strong norms of what an individual does within their camp. Everyone has to share. So there's small groups, so you can monitor everyone. So any food that you bring back into camp, it's going to have to be shared whether you like it or not, right? And in fact, some people, there's a debate whether it's really even sharing. Maybe we should even be calling it tolerated theft. And so what I'm trying to say is that I guess, I think that's part of the reason why hard work is valued and why I think that they like those other individuals who signal the ability to gather resources, because what really matters is whether you can get food back into camp in the first place, right? And I think that's going to matter for your own life, for the lives of your children, because food is shared and so forth. And I just think that when it comes down to it, they're highly rational, and I think that, yeah, if that person is going to save your child from getting eaten by a lion, or they're going to give you some extra calories and your children extra calories, I think that's going to matter. But I don't know. It's an interesting question, and I'm speculating about the generosity thing too. So now I'm like, this is extra speculation, an extra level of it. Yeah, I don't know the answer.
I was wondering if you've considered, even in Western societies, asking people to play these games in multiple contexts of their lives, so with coworkers, friends, and so on, to see if people are consistent across those contexts, or if they actually calibrate as well. So it's not just that society itself.
Yeah, there's been some work on longitudinal play in these games, and we found that individuals play, at least in the same setting, like in the lab setting with other people that they don't really know, people do display consistency in how they play these games, right? the thing is that, yeah, the Hadza, environment is changing a lot. They know these people really well, right? They're living with them all the time, and so forth. And so, yeah, the experiments aren't really comparable. So something like you suggest would be really interesting to see if they then map onto, the play of others, or just, after we, have us hang out and play a public goods game, and then after the end of the conference, we do it again, and we see if there's been some social influence. We're like, I don't know. It's interesting.
We're pretty much out of time, but yeah, there'll be time for one more question.
Okay.
I was just wondering, maybe I didn't pick up on this where it was in the data, but so what kind of attitudes would the Hadza have towards someone else not contributing in the public goods game? Like, I can understand being sort of a little selfish, but if they heard like, everyone else did neither, would like they be mad, or would they just think that was?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And I would say anecdotally, I see instances of trying to, so I say there's, 100% taxation in the Hadza, but there's like so much attempts at tax evasion, right? They're like, everyone's trying to like hide stuff, in their clothing. They ask to hide things under my Land Rover. They like, can I have some tobacco? I won't tell anybody, all of these sorts of things. And it happens a lot, or they come back from camp late at night so people can't see how much food that they brought in. So it definitely does happen. And usually, it's like, hey, what do you have under your shirt? Let's see. And then they're like, you caught me, right? And they don't seem that upset. And I'm making these kind of funny stories, but this is also true for games that you play with the Hadza, looking at third-party punishment and so forth. And actually, the Hadza engage in really low levels of third-party punishment, and which, again, is pretty interesting, especially in light of these stories. And I didn't have time to share the data with you, but I'm finding that there's, this is just an example of, there was a lot of cheating in the Hadza, so you can have them roll a die a number of times, and they get something if it goes one way, and if it goes another way, someone else gets something, and you have them go off and do this in private, and like, lo and behold, 30 times, like it landed on for self, right? Which is really interesting. But a lot of the stories actually, I can't find the data, let's see. A lot of the stories actually contained rewards for good deeds as well as punishment for bad deeds, which again is really interesting given their low rates of third-party punishment. So that's something I need to explore and figure out what's actually going on there and how is that handled in the Hadza. But okay, thank you everyone.